The X Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, REL-MAR McConnell Media Company, the X Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome one and all to the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell, and for the next 4 hours, I'm your host and your guide as together we cross the time-space continuum to this place that I call the X Zone. It's a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. It's a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. And the X Zone comes to you Monday through Friday from 10 p.m. Eastern until 2 a.m. Eastern, right here on the X Zone Broadcast Network, Talkstar Radio Network, Mutual Broadcast Network, Simul TV, and iHeartRadio. If you'd like to send us an email, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com, on all social media sites, Xzone Radio TV. And to find out about the programming we have available for you 24/7, 365 on the X Zone Broadcast Network, visit www.xzbn.net. Exonation, my first guest tonight is Gary Bates. He is an Australian who now heads up the U.S. Office of Creation Ministries International as its CEO. Gary has authored or co-authored 6 books on the issue of origins, but is best known for his book, Alien Intrusion, UFOs and the Evolution Connection, which went into being an Amazon top 50 bestseller. Now, Gary is one of the very few evangelical Christians who has an interest in and researches the UFO phenomenon. On January 11, his movie, Alien Intrusion, Unmasking a Deception, premiered in over 730 theaters across the U.S. and is currently screening in several countries around the world. Now, for more information on the movie and how you can get your very own DVD, which is now available, can be found at alienintrusion.com. First of all, Gary, thank you so much for joining us. Great pleasure having you here on the show. But what got you interested in the UFO phenomenon?
Well, I grew up a science fiction fan, so I didn't actually become a Christian until my adult years. And when I did become a Christian and worked for Creation Ministries, obviously we deal with the issue of origins.
Yes.
I started to revisit, as we do when you've had such a sea change, some of your previous held beliefs. And I started to realize that, when you look at science fiction, it still gets back to the issue of origins.
Mm-hmm.
People today believe that life evolved on Earth by one of two mechanisms, came on Earth by one of two mechanisms. Either it was evolved or, as the Bible says, there was a creator. Mm-hmm. But even when we look at in this enormously vast universe, there's still the only two games in town. And so when we, look at Star Wars and we see alien beings like, Jabba the Hutt, besides the fact he looks like he ate too many pizzas, they look different. So why do they look different? Well, I realized that, being a Trekkie and looking at their prime directive and not interfering with other cultures, and they're flying around the galaxy and they're seeing all of these different races at different stages of evolution. And so that's why they look different. Evolution took a different turn on their planets. So I kind of started to reinvestigate all of that. But I got more than I bargained for when I started doing the research and started attending UFO conferences. I found that there was a much more serious and even sinister backdrop to it all. And I suppose as a layperson to start with going in, I'm like every other layperson and perhaps some of your listeners who have lots of preconceived ideas about the things that people see in the sky or the claims of alien abductions, etc. What I found out is that something actually is going on, but it's not what most people think.
Well, what is going on, Gary?
Well, you mentioned the movie. If I can mention that, Alien
please,
Intrusion,
yeah.
Unmasking a Deception. We added a lot of new research in the movie that we didn't have in the book, and we call it a movie. It's a docudrama.
Mm-hmm.
But about half the interviewees do not come or do not possess, if you like, my Christian worldview. But it's very, very interesting that all the serious researchers, I mean, I'm talking back into the 60s with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who acted as a consultant for Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The lead character was a Frenchman by the name of Lacombe in the movie, but it was based on a real person, Dr. Jacques Vallée, who was a contemporary of Dr. Hynek's. Dr. John Mack, Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, these are the three big guns of abduction research. In fact, John Mack was formerly the professor of Harvard Medical School.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these guys, I mean, Hopkins is an avowed humanist. Mack says he was raised in a rationalist, kind of skeptical home, but purely on the weight of evidence, looking at the hundreds and hundreds of people they interviewed and hypnotically regressed, they became believers that something really was happening to these people. So what I can confidently say, and it might not sit well with some others, but what I can confidently say is that, a Christian researcher like myself and even the secular researcher, we all agree about the nature of the phenomenon. And that is, it is not advanced extraterrestrials flying here, millions of light years in their hyperdrive spaceships like we see in science fiction movies. It's impossible. For one, you'd have to defy the laws of physics. It's not a matter of advanced technology. But when you have non-Christians saying that the evidence suggests that they are coming from another realm or dimension, and we had a great clip with John Mack. This is this Harvard professor.
Right, and John Mack is, died several years ago.
That's right.
Yeah.
But to hear him actually say to another PhD psychologist on a TV show, he said, what we are dealing with is spirit beings who should have stayed in their realm, who are coming over here and conducting, rape-like experiments on humans.
Mm-hmm.
And he tried to defend it by saying, it was some sort of intervention. So that's what I mean when I say we can both agree about the nature of it. We might disagree about its origin or its intent, but we certainly all agree about the nature of the phenomenon because it's simply based on the evidence. And we can talk more about that if you like.
Yeah, sure. What is the evidence?
Well, the evidence is that there's two areas. Obviously, a UFO technically is an unidentified flying object.
Right.
And we've seen these things tracked on radar, traveling up to 7,000 miles per hour. And Rob, we just don't have any aircraft, military or otherwise, that can travel at those speeds. In the movie, we featured some clips from a Washington press conference where 80 Air Force officers, so these are just not enlisted men, in Washington were giving their testimony, and one of them says these lights were doing a grid search. They entered the missile silo, so these lights passed through solid objects.
So are we talking about Captain Salas at the press conference that was held by Stephen Bassett?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Yeah, and he actually says that they actually affected the operational readiness of American nuclear weapons. And this is startling. I mean, I work for a scientific organization, so we tend to be very, very skeptical, and I think we do apply a robust scientific discipline. But
Sure.
When you see these things tracked on radar and you have the physical evidence of them doing this,
Mm-hmm.
That's why I said something definitely is going on.
But we don't know exactly what is going on, and I think that a lot of the hype that is out there about the UFO extraterrestrial, connection is based on supposition. There's very little fact when it comes to the investigation of not only the UFO phenomenon, but the alien abduction scenario. Like, I don't know. I don't know why so many people put so much faith into hypnotic regression or hypnosis, because we had Bud Hopkins' ex-wife on the show, and she told us that Bud Hopkins was faking it all.
Yeah. Well, they did have a falling out towards
Yeah.
the end, and I think there might be a little bit more in that story, because nothing like a woman scorned. Because originally she did work with him for many years and was very, very happy to promote that work until she obviously fell out. Now you get a guy like David Jacobs, professor at Temple University.
Mm-hmm.
He's the only guy who's ever obtained a PhD on a UFO-related topic. But he would disagree with Hopkins and Mack. Hopkins and Mack worked quite closely with each other.
They did.
Because they thought these things might be viewed as beneficial or spiritual experiences. But of course, David Jacobs absolutely hated what it was doing to people.
Right.
And hypnotic regression, yeah, I mean, as soon as you mention that, people kind of have a knee-jerk reaction. But I have worked with hypnotherapists and people that I believe I can trust to test out my hypothesis. But hypnosis is a real thing. It can be done. But one of the problems is, unless you are skilled,
exactly,
you can inadvertently implant false memories and false suggestions.
Gary, you and I have to take our first commercial break. Please stand by. Exo Nation. Gary Bates is our very special guest this hour, and check out Gary's website where you can get your very own copy of Gary's movie. The website is Alien Intrusion. .com. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. Gary Bates and I will return on the other side of this break as we continue from our broadcast station and center and studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. We'll be back after the break. Don't go away. Exonation. Gary Bates is our very special guest this hour. His website, alienintrusion.com. Before we went to the break, we were talking about Dr. David Jacobs. We were talking about Dr. John Mack, Bud Hopkins, and alien abductions. The alien abduction scenario really didn't come on until the Betty and Barney Hill case going back to the 60s. And it seems that here we are in the year 2018, the alien abduction scenario seems to petered out completely. How come?
I'm not sure if I'd agree with that. I think we don't see it reported very much in the media, just like we don't see UFO sightings reported very much, because it's almost become mainstream. I mean, we just recently in Miami here, a lady was standing for the Senate, U.S. Senate, and she mentioned that she'd been a former alien abductee, and no one bats an eyelid. You've got Paul Hellyer in Canada, former Minister of Defense.
don't get me going on Paul Hellyer, because he's a sore topic up here to Canadians.
Exactly. So what I mean there is the media kind of switches off, because I think we've seen these things for so many years now. Yeah. So many people claim it. It really doesn't make that much news. But the reality is, if you talk to MUFON researchers, there are still, well over 100 UFO sightings every day. Of course, the majority can be explained, as either natural or man-made objects. But the problem is, you see, because in our sci-fi age, belief in life on other worlds, the idea that we think aliens can build faster than light spaceship and stealthily abduct people in the middle of the night, people look up, and they mistake the planet Venus for a UFO.
Sure.
The planet Venus accounts for 27% of all sightings, believe it or not. So, I do think it is continuing. One of the things that surprises me, I mean, if you know this topic, it's so bizarre and so weird. I was actually asked on another radio program, does anything surprise me? And as John Keel says, if you don't have your head screwed on, it'll really mess with you. So
exactly.
The weirdness of it doesn't surprise me. But I have to say, what really does surprise me is actually how many people have claimed this alleged alien abduction experience. And on our website, we actually have a link there that says, tell us your story, because I realize that a lot of people have never told anybody. I mean, you can't exactly go to work the next day and say, hey, fellas, let me tell you what happened to me last night, and talk about the rectal probes or whatever. So the issue there is giving some people some ability to tell their story in safety. And since the movie came out in the US, I've literally been inundated with people telling the story. So in short, if there is one thing that does surprise me, it's actually how many people it's happened to and is happening to.
But how many of these people are just looking for 5 minutes of fame?
Exactly. I'm glad we're on the same track, because that's the point I was going to make next. There's something called the classic abduction syndrome, and we feature it in the movie, the CAS, and there's basically a set of 8 markers that investigators use to try to determine the nature. So, they're driving their car, they're in bed at night, after they have been regressed, or they recount stories about being on board a spaceship, stories. Sometimes they'll have scratches or markings. Now, not everybody has all 8. But let me give you an example. Right in the early days, when I was first writing my book, we got a call in the office. And somebody answered the phone, and of course they had no idea, but they said, well, we actually have somebody who's researching this. Would you like to talk? And she was actually a doctor, a lady working at a hospital. And I said, look, it's rather difficult to talk on the phone. How about we meet? And I went out to see her and had a cup of coffee. And her daughter was in her 20s. And she was claiming that she was being visited by aliens, and it was obviously just freaking her out. And I just asked questions. I said, so, describe the nature of the experience. I said, was it a black entity in the room? And I just went through a few of these items in the classic abduction syndrome. But then I just turned around and said, was there any encounters of a sexual nature? And I can remember her reaction. Literally, her jaw dropped and hit the ground, because she said, I have told nobody that. And she went, oh, my goodness, it must be true. So, when I question people, I say, do you watch science fiction movies? Because, you can go to bed and you can dream about things, and dreams can be vividly real, just like having a falling dream. It feels physically real, but, it obviously didn't happen. So you've got to try to go through that. And as you would be aware, one of the great problems in the whole UFO movement is there are a lot of hoaxes.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that play fast and loose with the truth. I meet them all the time, because they want you to believe what they believe. And when they go out and interview people, and when they go out and hypnotically regress people, they're looking for signs that these are really aliens from another planet. So you can inadvertently lead your witness consciously and even subconsciously. And of course, as we know, I mean, my book, I revisited some of the, the biggest UFO events and the movers and shakers of the 60s and 70s. And overwhelmingly, by and large, most of those guys were actually frauds. I'm talking about Adamski and others. Frank Strangers, for example.
Oh my gosh, yeah, the late Dr. Frank Strangers, yeah.
So as I said, when you take someone like John Mack, we have a clip in our movie where he appeared on the Oprah show. So you've got to remember, this guy was a professor of Harvard, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist on a book he wrote about the history of the Civil War. So he's no lightweight, but he, based on the evidence, he said, look, I'm a clinical physician. He said, fantasy does not present itself like this. Lies do not present itself like this. He said, the only thing that presents these symptoms is real experience and trauma. And that's what led him to becoming a believer, because as he toured around the country, interviewed these people, they're not connected with each other. They don't have the same backgrounds. They're in different demographics. Some of these people themselves were lawyers and, the other people from academic backgrounds that had a lot more to lose than to gain from telling the stories. And of course, Mack himself obviously had a lot more to lose. I think he was an embarrassment to the Harvard Medical School, but he would not resile from what he found. And, even though, as I say, we might disagree about whether they're beneficial in the origin of them, but I do applaud him at least for being honest with the evidence.
But even professionals seem to want to have their 5 minutes of fame. For example, Captain Salas, Bob Salas.
Yeah.
The story he tells can be explained by other members of the military who have no interest in the UFO phenomenon. So it's just like Edgar Mitchell, the Noetic Center. He believes in UFOs. He believes in extraterrestrials. Paul Hellyer, well, he once he got out of politics, he had to do something. And I had him on the show, and I asked him point blank, as the Minister of Defense for Canada, at any time, did you receive any, and I was talking about the military, receive any reports of UFOs? His answer was unequivocally no. And yet today he tells the story about how the military was getting all these UFO reports.
Yeah.
So who do like somebody just coming into the interest of the UFO phenomenon? Who are they to believe if they can't believe, a former Minister of Defense and Deputy Prime Minister of Canada? You look at the Roswell case; that's got more holes in it than a piece of Swiss cheese in Billy Meyer's fridge, for goodness sake. And there's another whack job, Billy Meyer. Yeah,
well, I've actually been on the receiving end of threats from his U.S. representative. So
who Michael Horn?
Because of comments I made on our website.
Michael Horn?
He was investigated 3 times in 2 of them were sting operations, and his wife blew the whistle. And I kind of said, 3 strikes, you're out.
Yeah.
And so he actually tried to accuse me of, being a Christian and selling books for profit, and it was basically email stalking me for a while.
Oh, listen, so, we had Kevin Randall, who has a radio show on our network. It's called A Different Perspective, and Kevin asked if he could arrange a debate with Michael Horn. Right. Michael Horn started badgering him by email.
Yeah.
And
I've been subject to it as well.
And so finally I got involved and I said, hey, knock it off or it's not going to happen. Finally, the debate took place. And, Michael Horn fell very, very far away from any substance into proving his case.
Yep. Well, I totally agree with you. And as I say, I obviously come at it from a Christian perspective. You said that there's so much supposition. I'd actually say what there is presupposition. And every researcher, every scientist will try to look at the information. And if we're absolutely honest, we all have a bias with which we approach the facts.
Right.
And so, when it slots in nicely with our worldview, obviously we're going to do that. But when the case of Roswell, for example, in the movie, we have an interview with Bill Clinton on Jimmy Kimmel, who says he reopened the Roswell files. There's been 4 separate investigations into Roswell, and it's obviously Project Mogul. It's what I believe, but people still don't want to believe. And every year, Roswell still doubles in size every July 4 weekend. People going there looking for meaning and purpose. So there is a deep religious yearning and aspect that inflicts the UFO phenomenon.
Let's talk more about this on the other side of our news break. Gary Bates is our special guest this hour, X-Zone. Check out his website. Get a copy of his DVD that is out if you can't get to one of the theaters around the world where it's playing. The website is alienintrusion.com. I'm Rob McConnell. This is the X-Zone. Don't go away. Gary, we were talking about Roswell, and one of the things that I could never understand, and no one in the Roswell belief camp can answer, is one very simple point that I bring up. Jesse Marcel goes to the alleged crash site, picks up evidence as the base intelligence officer, and I'm an ex-cop, so I know that when you're at a crime scene, you take the evidence into your custody and you bring it right back to a secure area so that the chain of custody is not broken. But in the case of Jesse Marcel, what does he do? He stops at his house, wakes up his wife and his kid, lets them manhandle this evidence, and then brings it to the airbase. Why did he do this?
Well, I think the report says he was excited and he took it home and said, look what I found, look what I found. It was the wreckage of an alien spaceship. So, 1947, you've got to remember that was the explosion of the whole UFO phenomenon.
Right, that's a great excuse for why he did it. But when it comes to legalities, proper protocol, like I don't know anybody besides Jesse Marcel who goes to a crime scene or a crash site and brings debris home instead of maintaining the chain of custody. And yet to the UFO community, many of them need psychiatric evaluation, in my opinion. This is okay because it's Jesse Marcel and it's the Roswell case.
Of course. Always the end justifies the means. And, we spoke about the fact that there's so much misinformation. I mean,
Sure.
Take crop circles, for example. You hear claims that the stalks cannot be bent over by any human means. They're done so perfectly and so precisely. Energy emanates or radiation emanates from the site, and the cellular structure of the corn or something has changed. There is absolutely not a single shred of documented evidence that that's ever the case. And in my book, I show how two old geezers in the UK, Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, actually admitted that they were doing it, and no one believed them. So with a simple plank and 2 bits of rope, they went out and created a very elaborate crop circle in the middle of the night, filmed by a TV crew. Mm-hmm. And then in the morning, the specialists, who are now called seriologists, came out and duly pronounced it as a genuine crop circle of extraterrestrial origin. So, as I said, we have to be discerning. The problem is, I've got interviews on YouTube and everything else, and people come in and they just immediately dismiss what doesn't fit with their particular view. And one of the things I want to say about the movie is I do believe that it is strongly evidence-based. Yes, we're up front and open and honest about our Christian worldview, and we draw a conclusion at the end. But
right.
The first 80% of the movie just looks at the evidence and says, what is it? Craft cannot fly at hundreds of millions of kilometers per hour.
That's right.
The G-forces, dust in space, cosmic radiation, and so on and so forth. It's a physical impossibility. But as I said, I do believe something is happening. Mm-hmm. We do see objects that defy naturalistic explanation. And when I said earlier we agree about the nature of it but disagree about the origin, I believe that it is spiritual in nature, spiritual in origin. And of course that fits right within the wheelhouse of traditional Christianity, because it's always believed that there is a spiritual realm. It's
right.
always described that beings come from that realm, can manifest in our realm, they can affect our environment, they can even kill people on occasions. And of course we're talking about what the Bible calls angels.
Right.
But again, you see, we're afflicted by a cultural view of angels as these kind of ethereal spirit beings with fairy wings. But I challenge someone to read the Bible, because it's never once actually how they're represented in the Bible, for example.
I have the greatest respect for you because of your Christian beliefs. I, too, am a Christian. I'm not afraid to admit it. But the Bible also provides, in my opinion, the examples of those who came to earth in biblical times, the Nephilim. So if the Nephilim can and have been reported and recorded in biblical times, how come people aren't looking back and saying, well, geez, if they were here and they chose the fair women of earth to have children with, and look at the other parts of history. I like you cannot understand why everybody looks up to the sky and waiting for the little gray men or green men from Mars to come here and say we're here. When I believe too that the Bible, in my opinion, is the Rosetta Stone of life. Any answer to any question that you want is in there. You just have to look for it.
Well, one of the issues is, as I said, I think we're afflicted by our culture. We're enamored with science fiction. People are fascinated with the future, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And we look up in the sky, and the normal inclination is to go, wow, it's so big, I wonder what else is out there. And even Christians suffer from the concept that, we might be the only life here. But what's interesting is, with our increased technology, is the further and further we do look out into
Mm-hmm.
space, increasingly the Earth looks special. How is it just by chance our Earth happens to be just in the Goldilocks zone in our solar system, from our sun? How come our solar system is also in the Goldilocks zone when it comes to our Milky Way galaxy? Because if we're any closer, we'd get fried by cosmic radiation from the galactic central bulge. And there's about 120 examples of something known as the anthropic principle that show that the conditions are just right here on Earth. So you either got to say, well, that came about by chance,
Mm-hmm.
random processes, a big bang 14 billion years ago, a cosmic explosion of time and space, or there is a designer and there's a creator. But, when we look back at Genesis 6, it actually wasn't the Nephilim that intermarried women. It was actually the sons of God. It was the sons of God.
Well, what's the difference between the sons of God and the Nephilim?
Well, the Nephilim were the offspring between the sons of God and women. So the sons of God, when you look throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrew term there is B'nai Elohim.
Mm-hmm.
So B'nai Elohim literally means sons of God.
Okay.
Now, in the New Testament, we're called sons of God. That is believers, but that's because it was attributed to believers being born again, by the Spirit of God. But in the Old Testament, okay, in every other example where B'nai Elohim is used, everybody understands that as angels. So I'll give you an example. In the beginning of the book of Job, it says Satan and the sons of God came to present themselves, before God. Satan means accuser, and of course he accused God of favoring Job because of everything Job had. But when we get to that Genesis 6:4 passage, people say, oh, well, it can't be angels. Because, again, we have this cultural view of angels as being spirit. In fact, I just wrote an article this week and said, what is spirit? Because actually in the Bible, this term spirit has many terms and connotations.
Mm-hmm.
We can say, it says, for example, this man had a spirit of jealousy, right?
Right.
It calls angels ministering spirits. But Christians believe that we are also not only physical. If you're a Christian, you're not only physical, you have an eternal spirit. So it's not the sum of who we are, but it's part of our being. So when we look at angels appearing in the Bible, think about the three that sat down with Abraham. They ate food.
That's right.
So hang on, they manifested, and they must have had stomach organs and digestive tracts. And what about the clothes they were wearing? And then we have obviously the account of Sodom and Gomorrah, where they appeared as nice-looking men, but they had the power to strike the Sodomites blind. We have an account of God's destroying angel appearing in Scripture, killing the firstborn in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and also 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. So that's what I mean. The Bible says they can affect our environment, they can harm people, and they have the ability to flit, if you like, in and out of our realm and manifest in various forms. And you know what? That's exactly what we see in the UFO phenomenon. And that's why I said something's actually happening. And because you and I can't physically test that, we can't lasso a UFO and bring it in and do empirical scientific tests. And we can talk about this next if you like, but I believe it's in what people are recounting and told during their abduction experiences where we can actually unpick the true nature of it.
Okay, so a lot of people believe that the Bible is basically metaphor. It was written by those who really didn't have a knowledge of the earth sciences and what we know today. So how do you explain to people that wait a minute, no, what happened back then is still happening today? How do you explain that?
Well, the Bible is a history book. It's not a science book, but if we believe it is the words of the creator of the universe, where it touches on scientific aspects, it should be accurate. And as I said, I work for a scientific organization. We, in fact, employ more PhDs than any Christian organization in the world throughout our 7 offices around the world. And all of those guys, they got their PhDs in the very same secular universities as their evolution-believing counterparts. See, when it comes to the past, Rob, you and I, it's just like the UFO phenomenon.
All right, Gary, I'm going to have to do
this.
this. I've got to take a break. We'll be right back. Exonation, fascinating conversation with our guest this hour, Gary Bates, and his website is alienintrusion.com. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. Gary and I will be back on the other side of this break as we wrap up this hour from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away. Exonation. Gary Bates is an Australian who now heads up a U.S. office of Creation Ministries International as its CEO. He has authored or co-authored 6 books on the issue of origins, but is best known for his book Alien Intrusions, UFOs and the Evolution Connection, which went on to be an Amazon top 50 bestseller. He is one of the very few evangelical Christians who has an interest in and researches the UFO phenomenon. On January 11, his movie Alien Intrusion, Unmasking a Deception, premiered in over 730 theaters across the U.S. and is currently screening in several countries around the world. Now, do yourself a favor. Go to www.alienintrusion.com. First of all, Gary, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a great pleasure having you with us. But tell me, with all the research that you've done, what is the truth behind the UFO phenomenon?
Well, obviously, we've discussed how people approach it with a preconceived view, and the most popular view today is that people think that aliens are stealthily abducting them in the middle of the night for some greater good. The reality is they've done nothing for us. You might be familiar with Joe Jordan of MUFON.
Yes.
He's now based in South Korea. He's the national director there. We went to interview him. He basically said that. And when you think about it, people try to excuse the bad behavior. If these aliens have been watching humankind for thousands or even millions of years, as some people think, don't they know the deleterious effects with, stealthily taking people from their bed in the middle of the night, subjecting them to all sorts of grotesque medical experiments? All the research as the doctors show that people suffer post-traumatic stress syndrome. If they're really trying to help us, why do they do that? Why do they hide their true intention, like Dr. Jacques Vallée noticed? Now, when you talk to some of these people, what Joe Jordan found out, and he didn't start off, I should point out, as a Bible-thumping Christian. It was actually the evidence that ended up making a believer of him. He didn't become a Christian well into his 40s. And he said, look, instead of looking at who is being abducted, he said, is there any segment of population? It's all so weird. He said, let's just think outside the box. Is there anybody who seems to be exempt from it? And then going through their research, because he's a field investigator, he said, well, look at this case. And he said there was an example where this gentleman, in the moment of his terror and panic, he uttered the words, help me, Jesus. And he said the experience immediately stopped. And so, again, remember, he wasn't a Christian at the time, and it's quite funny because he said they started to look through this. It was reported in the Florida Today newspaper, and they were inundated with similar stories. So they said, well, let's do the research a bit further. What is it about Christians that aliens don't like? And that's how they approached it. And so they took themselves off to a church, enlisted in a Bible study to try to find out, facets of the Christian faith to see what might make Christians immune from this. And that's when they had the revelation that they weren't really dealing with physical aliens, but deceptive spiritual beings from another dimension. And Joe has become a good friend. He's now got over 400 cases where these experiences have been halted by people either becoming Christians, invoking the name of Christ, etc. Now, I want to point out here, some people listening to this might say, well, I called on the name of Jesus and it happened again. There's two aspects there. One is, Joe said he found that some people who called themselves Christians were having the experience. He came to describe them as the talk Christians. But he said there seemed to be a noticeable absence of people who believed the Bible to be the Word of God, applied it to their lives, and tried to live Christian lives. In other words, they believed in the power of God and Jesus Christ and His Spirit. And so that's pretty hard to ignore when you've got over 400 examples now of this being the case. And of course, people listening to this, they might just poo-poo that and say, well, of course he's going to say that because he's a Christian, and so on and so forth. But as I said, the movie interviews, 50% of the interviewees are secular researchers, and they know about this. I mean, I interviewed Nick Redfern, who's kind of the History Channel's, go-to UFO guy and ancient aliens and UFO hunters.
We've had Nick on the show many, many, many times.
Yeah, he's a lovely guy.
Yes.
And, we talked about this, and he said, yeah, I know about it. And in fact, he wrote a book based on interviews with a man called Ray Boucher, who was contacted by the U.S. government because he was in an unusual situation of being a priest, but also a MUFON field investigator. And Nick actually even turns around. So, folks, this is a guy who's not a Christian. I mean, I tried to win him into the camp, but he wasn't interested. But he said, there's no question. He said even some sections of the government recognize that they are dealing, and he used these words, literally, with something demonic. So, at the end of the day, that's what the evidence suggests. We have interviewees with former abductees who talk about their experiences and what happened to them as well.
All right. With the increase of the interest in UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, and so on, is this all part of a demonic plan then? Let me ask you this. Is WWW really 666?
Well, again, you've got to pick the eyes out of that one. I think Bigfoot. I'm not a convert to that. I think the whole thing's a hoax, and they just make movies out of and TV shows out of speculation, like they do with ghost hunters. But there is real power in the occult. I mean, again, the Bible is very, very clear. God warns to have nothing to do with fallen angels or deceptive entities. You can see the history in the Bible where people built altars, etc. And look, here's an example. Take the case of Egypt. I've been to Egypt. I've written articles about Egypt. That whole ancient culture was dedicated to, the multitude of gods. They had a god for everything. And we can look at that and laugh at it. But I believe when you look at some of the things that you read about, that there was real power. And here's the God of the Bible inflicting 10 plagues upon Egypt. And it's interesting, I often say to Christians, who was God battling? And they say Pharaoh. No, read the Bible. He was demonstrating his power against the gods of Egypt. So the God of the Bible believed that the gods, or the demigods who'd set themselves up as an authority, in fact, were real.
Well, can I ask you this then? Can I ask you this? Talking about gods and demigods and what God was doing, it was basically flexing his muscles. How come he never did that with all the different Indian gods?
Well, that's not something I'm too familiar with. I mean, maybe he did, and it's just not as well recorded. I don't know, because Egypt, obviously, we have more leftover archaeology and architecture and writings than any other culture because of their obsession with the dead. So I profess some ignorance on that one, Rob, but
I was just wondering.
At the end of the day, I still don't think God is going to be outdone. But here's the thing. he's pretty clear in the Bible. He basically says, look, if you want to go after this stuff, you can have it. I'm not going to stop you. It's real.
Yeah.
You have a choice. I think the passage in 2 Thessalonians, it says, God will send them a strong delusion that they will believe a lie. What that's really saying is hey, you want to play with the Ouija boards, you want to dabble in the occult, well, guess what? It's going to be real. And that's why people get invested in it, because they sometimes see its power and they won't recognize the deception for what it is. A wise man once said, there's nothing new under the sun.
That is so true. That is so true. So what's next for you, Gary?
Well, I'm still busy promoting the movie. I've actually just got back from overseas. I was in Singapore and then Australia with some movie premieres, and it's been very, very exciting. I mean, this is a subject, particularly in the church, that people don't have anything to do with. And one of the aims of this movie was to try to create awareness, because like me, I thought it was all cranks and hoaxes and people wanting their 5 minutes of fame. But there really is a serious side of it, and people are being spiritually afflicted. And so I wanted to also provide the movie as a portal of hope, so that people could see that someone understands. Because a lot of these people have been to the church. And you've had Guy Malone on the show.
We had a super time with Guy.
We had Guy in the movie, and he said, he said the church doesn't want to deal with it. It's too weird. But, if people are being spiritually affected, this is right in the church's backyard.
Right. So if people are being...
should be informed about it. They should be able to do something about it. Should be able to help these people. And so that was, one of the aims of the movie. And in the US now, we're having screenings in churches as well. So we're busy doing that. People can host a screening in their church.
Tell me, are you getting converts?
We are. We've had people that have kind of been sitting on the fence and have said, it really confirmed what I always believed. As I said, people are sharing their experiences. It's giving them confidence. And, the interesting thing, Rob, is there's always an entry point with this stuff. It could be as simple as a pre-belief in the idea that extraterrestrials can fly millions of light years and visit you in your bedroom in the middle of the night.
Right.
It could be an involvement in the occult. I've even found people who were abused as children, never had any closure. It's almost like satanic forces watchers, and they kind of know what weak spot to get in. And some cases, just helping one person, they were very fearful in nature.
Gary,
they were Christians and understood the power and nature of it, but struggled to really make a stand against it. So,
Gary, I hate to do this, but we've run out of time for tonight. I want to thank you so much. Please keep up the great work and keep us in the loop. And like I told you off air, if there's anything we can do to help, just let us know.
Thank you, Rob.
Take care, Gary. Gary Bates has been our guest. His website, www.alienintrusion.com. I'll be back after the news at 6.5 minutes past the top of the hour. Don't go away.